Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for being here.
Hello.
We'll just give it a couple of minutes while a few more people arrive. And then I have a very short video to share about Catalyst 2030. And then I'm going to hand over to Mark and David.
Perfect. Fun to see. Definitely seeing a lot of familiar names here. It's great to see you all. Also, a lot of new names. So for those of us that haven't connected before, looking forward to going here once Anthony gets us kicked off. It's good to see you all.
Hopefully everyone's not completely zoomed out. And I know those who have been attending the event have probably already had a pretty long info-filled day. So thanks for joining us.
Catalyst 2030 started life as a WhatsApp group among social entrepreneurs, connecting to envision real transformational change. Launched at the World Economic Forum in January 2020, it's grown into a global movement, accelerating change to ensure the SDGs are reached by 2030. Fueled by passion, our 550 members working in 175 countries have collectively put in an amazing 50,000 volunteer hours, touching the lives of 2 billion people. And we're driven by values, to which we hold ourselves accountable. 2020 was a busy year, co-creating 3 reports with partners and producing one of our own. Inviting high-level guests to participate in the Catalyzing Change campaign, hosting fireside chats and expert hours, which will be continuing in 2021. To celebrate our achievements, together we placed our supporters in the limelight with the first Catalyst 2030 Awards for Systemic Change. With the blessing of the Dalai Lama, we celebrated finalists and winners in the following categories: special recognition for our early supporters, individual philanthropists, donor organizations, philanthropic intermediaries, corporate organizations, bi- and multilateral organizations, and 4 regional winners in the category of national governments. And now on to Catalyzing Change Week 2021. During this social entrepreneur-led event, we bring together diverse stakeholders in over 100 sessions to showcase their systems change efforts and the best practices that can accelerate our work in pursuit of the SDGs.
So that's it from me. I'd just like to say that this session will be recorded. So if anyone has a problem with that, please let me know in the chat. And then I would like to hand over to Mark and David.
Perfect. I think I'm on mute. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Maybe a quick thumbs up from someone. Make sure that's showing up okay, working okay. Perfect. Awesome. Thanks everybody for being here. Anthony, thank you. MovingWorlds is a member of Catalyst 2030, have been for not quite a year, but specifically we're also part of a working group, Working Group 7, that specifically looks at corporate engagement with the social enterprise movement. And there is a lot of, I think, exciting, I want to say more than conversation that's happening on this intersection between corporations and social enterprise, but there are some big problems still to be addressed, especially around policy work and movement building. And it's, I think, those types of efforts where having the type of organization support and air cover, if you will, that groups like Catalyst 2030 are providing is so important to us. There are a lot of familiar faces on the call. I know some of you actually heard maybe too much of my voice even on a webinar yesterday, but it's wonderful to see you all again. We're going to go through the presentation here and then open it up with Q&A. And Dave Lair, who's a senior advisor to MovingWorlds, who helped us actually do the research that we're going to be talking about, is on the call as well. And we'll go into some Q&A at the end. But as we go through here, especially seeing the representation here on the crowd, like, do not be shy. type a question in over chat, jump in, interrupt, ask a clarifying question. Otherwise, what I'll try and do is just kind of buzz through some of the beginning work. So really quickly, MovingWorlds, global organization, team on 5 continents, support career development programs for professionals via our institute. We work directly with social enterprises to help them build the capacity so that they can partner increasingly to help make global value chains, supply chains, and distribution chains more sustainable and equitable. And we also work directly with companies. We have for over 7 years now, including companies like Microsoft and PayPal, SAP, and others who are partnering increasingly with the social enterprise sector. And we're always asking this question of like, okay, what is the biggest lever that we have at our disposal, right? To borrow a quote from Archimedes, give me a lever long enough, a place on which I can put it, and I can move the world. And so for us, we consistently look at like, what is one of the biggest forces, right? And you have to look at the economy as being one of those forces. And so here, what you can see on this graph is a comparison of $12 trillion, which is the amount of money that exchanges hands in business-to-business transactions that involve small and growing businesses, right? So if you actually look at all business-to-business transactions just globally, that number is actually closer to $80 trillion. But if you look at the transactions that actually also connect to small and growing businesses, that number is over $12 trillion. Now, the number much smaller here beneath it, 150 billion, is the amount that all governments spent in 2019 on international aid combined. A non-trivial number to be sure. We still need international aid. There are places where aid and philanthropic capital will go where the economy never will. However, we look at that number and say, so much of that money, so much of that economic activity is often being spent in a way that does deplete the environment and it does propagate inequalities, right? And I think many efforts actually feel like we are trying to, kind of refill with shovels what we have taken out with dynamite and machines. And so the question is, how do we change that, right? And I think to help think about that, I think about a cup of coffee, A, because I live in Seattle and I have an addiction to it, but B, because I think it's really easy to just kind of understand and look at, right? We're seeing this big movement so that if you buy a cup of coffee at a coffee shop, it is sustainable. Even the cup that you buy it in is sustainable or reusable. But if you spend money at a coffee shop, 90% of the money that you spend will actually ripple through the economy, right? It will trade hands with businesses, small and large, as it works all the way back to the start of where that coffee originates, right? Which is on the land with farmers. And sometimes there are big businesses like international freighters that might be shipping, but oftentimes there's small businesses, there's cooperatives, there's the nonprofit sector. And the question is, how can we make this entire chain more sustainable and equitable? Because you can never have a sustainable cup of coffee until all the enterprises working alongside of this chain are also sustainable and equitable, right? And to use a quote here from the creative director at Gucci, we have gone too far in the way that we think about and build out our global supplies, right? We are actually burning the house that we live in. And I think we all look at this and we know this, right? But there are really inspiring examples of organizations that have developed to make supply and distribution chains more sustainable and more equitable, right? And they've done this in partnership with also other small social enterprises, but also with larger corporations. And so staying on the coffee train, I think a coffee which started as a farmer roasted direct to consumer coffee social enterprise, right? So farmers actually roast their own coffee, which increases the margins on that product up to 10x. And then they are selling those directly to consumers. Now, they were moving more product, they were growing, But since then, they've actually developed partnerships with universities and corporations where they're supplying bulk amounts of coffee, and they've also become ingredient suppliers to different types of meal and even milkshake kits that people buy, which all of a sudden creates massive long-term revenue contracts that actually create a more stable way in order to grow. And we see this with groups like Neuro International and Farmer Education, Esque Labs with data science and future forward technology training, or ARED pictured in the upper left, which is solar power charging and Wi-Fi hotspots that can get set up even in 100% disconnected communities, and also in, oh, question, did my audio just drop for a second? Are we okay? We're good.
You're good,
okay.
Mark.
Perfect, thank you. And so we're seeing all these inspiring organizations that are then building partnerships with the corporate sector. And I feel like now something like this doesn't even need to be stated, but this is US specific data. But if you look at all the gray lines in this chart, these are the different economic recessions. And you see the highest earners and the lowest earners with these kind of dark green and then lighter green lines. And if you actually see where inequality gaps increase the most, right, it's in the time immediately following recessions, right? So this is why we really feel like, especially at this time, if we want to address the pending income inequalities that are going to result, like we really need to focus on what happens. Yes, of course, now during, respond to the crises that are happening and continue to kind of shock us, it feels like, on a weekly basis. But we also really need to think about, as we rebuild from this, how can we rebuild more sustainably? And this is also pending on the back of the climate crisis that we know is there. So we are dealing with inequality, and it's addressing us on social issues. We're also dealing with the fact that as economies are restarting and governments roll back environmental regulations for the sake of spurring economic development, right, this has serious costs. And this is why we look at the social enterprise. And we're standing at this point where, according to a report from Just Capital, the majority of people actually say that, I believe that capitalism is the best tool we've got, right? It might be the best of the worst, but it is the best, but it does need a change, right? And there are other people, of course, that say, no, capitalism will never be that solution and we should look elsewhere. But the majority of people actually believe this. And companies are actually starting to really model this. This report from 2019 from PricewaterhouseCoopers or PwC SDG Challenge shows that 72% of publicly reporting companies actually mention the Sustainable Development Goals in their reports. There's an important distinction here in that many just mentioned them, right? Only 14 actually have specific targets, and that's really what we need to create a move, right? We need, and according to PwC, we actually need to see a pretty notable step change where companies are actually reporting on SDG targets. And just to give an example of this, I was looking at a Microsoft report, this is about a month ago, where they were talking about how they have these very set commitments to be carbon negative, to be water neutral, to have pay inequality issues totally addressed. And that's like front page. You go in there, you see these targets that they have. And then I was looking at another report from Salesforce, which was mentioning the amount of hours that people volunteered and the amount of money that they gave, but there was no target associated with that. We're starting to see the shift away from that more towards actual targets. And the reason companies are actually saying, hey, we need to invest is there are proven ways that investing in social good efforts creates value for corporate partners. It creates new market opportunities. It helps move government regulatory relationships into a proactive and partnership driven, as opposed to a kind of big shift in operations. Increasingly, talent is inspired and attracted and retained by organizations that actually stand for a greater purpose and commit to the SDGs. It builds brand value with key stakeholders. So by this, I mean, if a corporate is trying to source something from suppliers and there are limited supply, those suppliers are going to do it with companies that share values. and then it also builds resilient and sustainable supply chains. And both COVID and the environmental crises are really putting supply chains in a lot of turmoil. And that's why you see actually agricultural being a massive investment, like groups like Unilever setting really bold targets, even Pepsi now setting very bold targets because of these supply chain components. But it's an interesting challenge because most executives, if you survey them, actually say, yes, we believe that. We actually know that corporate social responsibility does pay off, and there is, albeit in the long term, an economic incentive for engaging in these efforts, but most don't engage into it. And there's a really great Harvard Business Review article on this, the summary of it being, a lot of CEOs are free market capitalists. And so they believe, well, if it's such a great business benefit, then a company whose core competency is that should be the one to go and achieve that. So there's an interesting challenge, even as we start talking about the business benefits of this, that is realized by companies as they undergo these efforts. But there is a great report, and I'm biased because a partnership between MovingWorlds and SAP is highlighted in this report. But it's by the World Economic Forum that says, if we're going to recover from this effort, we are going to do it from these crises, we're going to do it in partnership with the social enterprise. And they highlight some really interesting partnerships between social enterprises and corporations for distribution, for sourcing, for product innovation, for design, nearly every element of a supply and a distribution chain. And so we set out actually at the end of 2020 to say, our companies, just a few of them like the SAP, and Unilever of the world, and IKEA, are a few of these companies investing in social enterprise, or is this really a movement, right? Are we looking down the pipe of a big increase in investment? And the answer is, of course, well, it depends. But David and I held, we touched over 75 people. We read a lot. Here's an example of the breakdown of people that we did interview. So you can see we spoke to a lot of corporate social responsibility leaders. We also talked to a couple of board members of publicly traded companies, impact investors, foundations, and more. We read well over 400 pages. In the last page of the report are the summary of the articles of report that we thought were the most interesting. And we will provide a link to the report in the chat box before we say goodbye to everybody. If you're really interested, this is what it looks like quite zoomed out. It turned into a pretty long report. But here are the key findings, right? So one is we consistently saw that companies were missing the biggest opportunity of our time, right? And in doing so, they were actually exposing themselves to risk, supply chain risk, but also competitive risk, and also new entrants into their sector's risk. CSR leaders, we met some people that were so cool. I need a better word for it, but just taking the moment, marching into executive offices, getting time with boards, saying, I've been telling you this for a decade. Now is the time to act. We should have done it a long time ago, but now is better than ever. And we're continuing to see them use this time to really integrate into the core of the business. However, the business is also saying, okay, cool, we'll do these things, but also remember, you still need to count those volunteer hours. You still need to count all those donations. You still need to do that employee engagement thing. And so all of a sudden, their workflows have increased, but their overheads haven't. So it's actually a really, really hard time to be a CSR leader. Social enterprises, talk to a social entrepreneur. You will talk to somebody that will ask you for money. They are overly focused on raising foundation capital or philanthropic capital, and we think they're missing really valuable opportunities to say, actually, go talk to the corporates, right? Find groups that through foundations, through corporate impact investing, through marketing teams, through market development teams, and others, through social procurement, there's actually money waiting for social enterprises if you go to them to solve a business problem, not asking for money. And so we actually think that there is a lot more opportunity to scale on revenue. Accelerators, we do see that because of the business models of accelerators, which is they buy equity from startups, they accelerate them, and then they get them to go sell that equity through a next level round. Accelerators are overly focused on funding as a result. Meanwhile, they actually provide a lot of value in helping corporates find social enterprises, and they can actually use those networks to help social enterprises connect into corporate sector, and therefore revenue opportunities. And the best fuel for growth for a social enterprise is revenue. So we think there's a massive opportunity there. And then policymakers, we do think they are missing out on innovation and sector building opportunities. And there is a Catalyst 2030 report actually on engaging the corporate sector, but we spent the least amount of time on policy. So we'll touch on that the lightest. Overall, we think that the social enterprise sector and partnerships with it will grow rapidly. 1/3 of new startups and small businesses being formed right now actually do have some type of formal social mission that are a part of their articles of incorporation, but still not enough are being strategic about what it means for their own organization. A couple of humorous moments before we get into questions, just to kind of help bring this into light. We spoke to people that were builders of social enterprise ecosystems, and we would ask the question, what is a social enterprise? And we heard every answer under the sun. There is still not a standard definition. The definition that we use is essentially, and I'll simplify it more almost into like a kind of a checklist, right? Is in the articles of incorporation, the legal operating agreement of the company, do they formally state some type of social and environmental mission, as well as their own internal practices to ensure that they're not propagating inequalities through their operations? It's a check. Are the executives actually, do the board members, are they responsible for actually monitoring progress against that mission? Are the executives monitored and compensated appropriately? And do they publicly report on these things? That seems to be the trend. There's a lot of different nice ways of explaining that. Some de-energizing moments. This from a board member. Companies are still legal entities that were incorporated for a reason. This is an important question, but it needs to be considered with long-term implications. We certainly get this, especially if you're a big investor. However, it is a moment where you say, we've got a lot of work to do if we're trying to shift that narrative. There were also some uplifting moments. This from a very senior leader of a global tech company, actually specifically calling out companies need to do more. In order to do more, they will need to partner with the social enterprise, and corporations are increasingly making audacious commitments around sustainability and equity. In order to get there, they must partner with social enterprises. And I feel like this, Dave, I don't know the last time that you saw a company made an announcement around like being, net zero or carbon neutral or water negative by, 2025 or 2030, but it's pretty much like one a week now. It feels like it's landing, except when it was Earth Day, then like 100 companies decided to all make some announcements, some good, some garbage, some personal commentary added in there. Some wow moments as well, right? Sustainable investing, this is a US specific data, growing rapidly year over year. The number of companies reporting on ESG, I want to present this one with caution, because you're like 96% of the global companies, the biggest 250 companies in the world, are reporting on ESG. Keep in mind that this is reporting, it's not target, right? So it's like, it's really good, but when you start to double click, you're like, okay, there's still actually a lot of room for greenwashing, so we need to be careful in here. I think this is really exciting. This is newer, actually, since after we released the report, but corporate impact investing is also growing pretty rapidly. And we think that, and have started to interview corporate impact investors, they are increasingly creating funds to spur social enterprise development, and even making acquisitions And so I think we're going to actually see a lot more corporate movement here. And one initiative that caught my eye is the PepsiCo South African Development Fund. If anybody wants to click into a real world example, there's some good coverage of that from news sites on the African continent that I think are worth looking at. So question is, what's the biggest lever that we have to create change, right? And this is a little bit different for everybody. But I think the way that we look at it is saying within companies, we are seeing marketers, social procurement leaders, or rather just procurement leaders now becoming social procurement leaders, advertisers, ops, travel teams, legal teams saying, if I need to do business with somebody, I can actually do it with a social enterprise. I can get the service that I need, and I can actually be spending money in a way that's going to help our company achieve some of their sustainability and equity targets. If anybody is interested, MovingWorlds did launch a program last year in partnership with SAP called SGRID, stands for the Sustainable Growth of Revenues for International Development, and it specifically helps social enterprises build capacity so that they can sell to and have the customer models in place to plug into these global value chains. But I think what I'll do is actually just open it up for questions now. We've also got our emails and LinkedIn's here if you do want to connect with Dave and I. Dave, I'll check in with you. Any questions that came up on chat that we want to address? Otherwise, what I'll ask is for you to actually do a little bit more of an intro, so we can learn a little bit more about you as we jump into the Q&A.
Sure. Well, thank you, Mark. Very interesting presentation as always. And of course, I'm biased because I helped with the work. And thanks, Anthony and Catalyst 2030. You know, there are really two things that excite me around social procurement. And the first is that social enterprises have always faced this challenge around scale. We know of many great social enterprises that are having a strong impact, but when you compare them to the typical for-profit sector, there's been a lot of challenges around scaling. And part of this, of course, has to do with the different objectives where you have a business focused on social impact that's often working with lower income folks that are most vulnerable and have the least ability to pay compared to businesses that are focused much more on profit and customers that have money. But I think that corporations hold at least part of the answer to scale. And, you know, as you've pointed out, many have huge distribution networks and purchasing needs and increasingly concerned with their impact on the world. And I think especially in agriculture, health, and energy, there's been a lot of movement to integrate social enterprises into the corporate world, partially due to their ability to reach communities that are harder to reach and to get into new markets. But I think that companies are also realizing that social enterprises are a real source of innovation and understanding and access to communities that they can't access. And in fact, just recently, the Social Enterprise World Forum launched the Social Procurement Community of Practice. It's open to anybody, and the real goal is improving and accelerating social impact performance. And a big shout out to SAP, who is one of the main corporate supporters of this. And, you know, the second big issue is around capitalism. And I think some sobering realizations brought to light by the coronavirus pandemic. And, you know, you go to events and you hear we're really at a crossroads, and people say that over and over again. But I think we really are at a crossroads as we begin emerging in that, you know, we've seen what's happened during the pandemic, and capitalism has really left us with lots of inequity around wealth and income, but certainly in access to basic needs around education, health, and of course, access to vaccines. And I think that, you know, one of the statistics that I kind of hate seeing is that the World Bank estimates that over 420 million additional people will be pushed into poverty, erasing many of the gains that we've made solely due to the impacts of coronavirus, but that billionaires' fortunes return to their pre-pandemic highs in just a few months, and recovery for the world's poorest might take a decade. But, despite these challenges, and maybe because of them, I think that the role of business is really changing. And there are growing expectations for businesses of all types, not just to focus on profit and reward to their shareholders, but that they really have to increase their value to society overall, and that those that don't are finding themselves increasingly underperforming their competitors. And I think, we see it largely showing up initially in ESG performance. Mark, you talked about the number of companies that are reporting. I think in a way, what's more interesting is how many of them are tying executive pay to meeting ESG targets. And so I just saw a study that said in almost half of the FTSE 100 firms are linking executive pay packages to their targets. And they're using, the carrot and the stick. And in this study, they said that the average executive in this FTSE 100 stands to see their bonus reduced by 15% if they don't meet these KPIs. Now, of course, these KPIs have to be valuable for ESG, but this is a huge thing. Clorox, Nike, Chipotle, Apple, Starbucks, BMW also recently announced that they're tying executive pay to ESG performance. Canada's 6 largest banks have all added ESG metrics to chief executives' performance. And so I think that this is a trend that is going to continue and really bodes well for corporations looking to partnering with social enterprises to really try to figure out how they're going to meet some of these goals around sustainability. So that's a pretty big intro, but those are some of the things that I'm seeing and finding exciting.
Cool. Yeah, thanks, Dave. I actually just this morning had a interesting conversation with the For Africa team at Microsoft, which is just a super dynamic and locally based team that's looking at how is tech innovation actually helping support the needs of the African continent, and some really cool innovations that have actually been developed out of that team that are also scaling and then being used as models everywhere. Two of these examples that pop up, one is a white space initiative. So TV white spaces, which is a signal that's being used, used to be for TVs, but you can also use those same white space signals for internet, especially in more rural areas. So that was a technology and a social enterprise movement that actually partnered and created those first on the African continent. We were able to develop those and actually then in partnership scale it up from just beyond the country where it was developed initially, and then from there actually spread globally. We're also seeing some innovations. David mentioned agricultural, as being a big focus area, and we're seeing the tech companies actually move there to say, hey, we actually have tech that we know could help, right? We operate these big clouds, but it's social entrepreneurs that are figuring out some of the really cool innovations, like in South Africa. I'll get the name wrong, I believe, but cold hubs, but essentially cold storage devices for farming communities, smallholder farmers, cooperatives that aren't as connected into the grid or don't have as reliable of a grid, right? And now you can actually improve monitoring. So you're seeing this big movement of companies saying, wow, like we can actually partner a lot more effectively now as we're getting to these environments that are also increasingly hybrid and with tech. So there's a ton of exciting movement that's happening, and all of these, to me, I look at this and go to social enterprises and say, there is money on the table, right? Now is your time to go earn it, right? Solve these opportunities And as you do that, continue to lead with your social mission as part of that pitch, because increasingly that's becoming something that is being required. I do see a couple questions. Oh, that came in. David, sorry, if you want to go and then I can process these questions.
I was just going to say, it's interesting that you talked about the work with Microsoft and the perspective from a technology sector. I think one of the things that you hit on that you didn't really discuss in depth is the growing rise of corporate social impact investment funds. And they're still small. They're still roughly, the Global Impact Investing Network estimates that the total impact investment market, there's about US 715 billion in assets under management, while corporate impact investors are only making up about 1% of that. But a lot of these are really geared at bringing social enterprises into their ecosystem and helping them solve some of the challenges that they're trying to work on. And just for example, Mars, which is a leading food manufacturer, has programs that are designed to enhance the productivity of the farmers in their supply chains. Some of these are around financing, some of these are around education. Walmart's doing the same kind of thing. So I think we're seeing more and more companies looking at, okay, there's business value to me here, but I have to step up my commitment in financing and capacity building, as well as, understanding how social enterprises operate. And I think that these social impact funds are kind of the tip of showing that understanding.
Yep. I'm going to jump into the chat box here. There's a great question here from Lena, two-part question. So a level of agreement, David, with what you were saying, but also a potential counter argument here, right? So how would you respond to those who state that corporations are only getting increasingly involved in the sustainable and philanthropic movement due to tax and executive pay incentives? 100%, we see this. We know there's a lot of greenwashing. I've had fun putting BlackRock on blast recently, who's like, everybody be net zero, right? And then, oh, by the way, don't look at our portfolio where we still have over $80 billion in oil and gas, right? So there's a ton of greenwashing that still really needs to get highlighted here. And I hear your question there, but let's stay with that. And then there's a second part to it, David. So, how do you respond to those that state that corporations are increasingly involved due to tax and pay incentives? And then two, wouldn't this reinforce the idea of trickle-down economics that many people disagree with?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I'd say, people do things and businesses do things that are generally in their self-interest. And governments at their best, and they're not always at their best, use taxes as a way to facilitate social outcomes. So I think the fact that there's increasing tax incentives to move people to do things is actually great, because it's an integrated approach backed by money. And whether you believe in, some of the things around social impact that we all support or not, having incentives to get you there is pretty important. And executive pay incentives are another really important lever, but maybe more than that, they're reflected by boards finally taking advantage of, or boards finally getting active and participating in some of these issues. So I kind of see those as good things. It's easy to argue that they're a stick and people are not going willingly, but it almost doesn't matter, because without these incentives, if the incentives are the wrong way, even if an executive wants to do something more socially valuable, it's hard for them to do that. On trickle-down economics, I think it's a question that we don't really know the answer to, but we do know that engaging enterprises of all types with business is really an effective way to scale. And I think, again, time will tell whether this will lead to further income inequality, but I don't believe it will. And I believe that it will actually help corporations kind of pave the way for seeing a different approach. But some of this remains to be seen. It's a great set of questions.
Yeah, and I think what Dave said there at the end, right, is the conversation that I feel like we're hearing a little bit more, right, where the capitalists and the lobbyists used to just say government. Well, there's no other way, right? There's the nonprofit sector, and there's the government, and there's us. There's no other way, right? And what social enterprises, I think, are showing is like, no, there actually is a way, right? You can actually set a limit between your highest paid and lowest paid employee, right? You can actually ensure that if we are sourcing from partners, they are partners that are also reporting on environmental and social good factors, right? You can actually impose these restrictions and not go out of business, right? So I think it's giving some power actually to the hands of corporations to say, I hear you've made that argument for the last when was the Dutch East Indies Company incorporated, right? 1600s, right? Like I've heard you've been making this argument for 400 years, but we're now looking at evidence that suggests otherwise. And in fact, we're seeing a increase in government requirements. Governments are moving into social procurement. That means some of the biggest government grants, which are massive amounts of money, are requiring things like some level of reporting and achievement on certain, not just reporting on, say, things like carbon emissions, but actually making requirements. Some of the big development banks are actually imposing some of those same requirements. If you're going to work on this infrastructure project, you are going to do things to ensure not just safety anymore, but actually pay equality, right? Or pay equality. So we're seeing a movement there that I believe is promising, but it's not enough. I don't think we can just let corporations go, and I think that's actually where you'll see the groups like Catalyst 2030 and the World Economic Forum COVID Response Alliance for Social Entrepreneurs play a bigger and bigger role, is getting governments to actually require not only disclosure, but also target setting. And one thing that I'm watching, like, and I'm way too interested in, considering that it's a task force, but under the Biden administration in the United States, there is a new task force looking at SEC reporting requirements. And I am very curious to see what's going to happen. Tim Mohin, who used to lead the Global Reporting Initiative, which is a framework that if you're an international company and you're going to report on environmental and social good factors, you should use the global, well, you are probably using the Global Reporting Initiative, maybe others as well. And he's come on pretty hot recently to say, and he was involved in our research, that you will actually start to see, even in the US, more specific targets. So I think that will also help create a move there.
Mark, I want to maybe just keep us back. We have two really interesting questions about social enterprises working with corporations, and let me read them out. Of course, everyone can see them, but one of the things I hear from corporations is that social entrepreneurs are too small scale for corporations to be able to work with. What do social entrepreneurs need to have in place? And how do corporations need to change their processes or systems? And within that, we've got a great questioner. What are some of the tools, platforms, strategies that corporations can use to identify social enterprises? Do you want to take a stab at that, and then I'll weigh in, because really a lot of MovingWorlds work is around that first question of preparing to work with corporations.
Yeah, so true, and sounds like every interview that we had with like the corporate teams who were like, I'm trying to get our companies to start sourcing from. So from the corporate perspective, right? Oftentimes money will flow through procurement, right? So somebody in charge of marketing will say, I need to run this campaign, and I've got a budget of $100,000 and I'm going to spend it. And they will go through procurement teams to figure out the different options on where they can spend it. Or they can say, I need a marketing agency to help me. So those procurement teams increasingly, Dave mentioned the word social procurement and the work group with the Social Enterprise World Forum. Those procurement teams are increasingly becoming educated to say, okay, as we do it, what are the selection criteria, right? Now, those procurement teams are then also running into the same problem of scale. So this is what the approach that MovingWorlds takes when it says, let's think about addressing this problem, right? The first is to identify who are the organizations that you're actually working with, and are there ways to support them in becoming social enterprises? Let's say achieving a B Corporation certificate or a bisocial certificate or others. So you're seeing some kind of take that path to say, let's actually work with the organizations that we work with, but let's help them achieve the same type of standards that we're expecting of ourselves. Pay equality, data ethics, carbon neutrality. The other one is, okay, let's go find new ones, and then how do we go find those? Those tend to be longer term investments. So Timberland did a really cool initiative a few years back of partnering with the Smallholder Farmers Alliance to actually create to cooperate with a slew of smaller single smallholder farmers specifically, develop a seed bank, create their own social enterprise model that was not owned by this was not Timberland social enterprise. They just said, hey, we think there is potential here. We will provide the seed funding so that as a larger cooperative, we will then buy all your cotton, organic cotton, if you can get to these things and also invest in agroforestry initiatives to ensure that there's reforestation initiatives happening. So they actually said, we will play the long game here. We will fund the initiative, and then we will also help bolster that with capacity building support. Very recently, IKEA just partnered with Acumen in East Africa to fund some relatively early stage social enterprises that have potential to scale up and get into there. So we're seeing these longer term investments. We, as MovingWorlds itself, are also seeing more strategic, I'll just call them social impact programs, where companies are saying, let's provide some seed capital, let's actually find some revenue from social procurement, let's take our employee volunteering initiatives, and let's move those all into a more strategic style of program that is specifically looking at building the operational capabilities of the supply chain that we work in. And so that means not only going to the social enterprises themselves, but also key distribution partners or other ecosystem partners. So what it requires for companies, so this is a very long answer to the question, is corporations actually need to look at this at a systems level and think about partnering with the type of entities that are critical to there, which do involve impact investors. They do require funders, and they do require capacity building efforts, right? And when we talk to companies is saying, like, this doesn't necessarily mean you have to go find a bunch of new money, right? Just be more strategic with the money that you're spending, and be more strategic with the type of initiatives that you are funding, right? You can do a one-off cause marketing campaign and kick a couple $100,000 to a nonprofit that you're never going to support again, or can you actually use that as part of a way to use philanthropic capital to de-risk social enterprise scale-up efforts, further support them with skills-based volunteering initiatives, coaching, and others. Also look at reverse placements, and then also educate employees within your company to understand what social enterprise movements actually are so that they can start to source them. So should have just answered that in one word, which is, or maybe two words, ecosystem approach. But Mark, I think, Dave, yeah, please.
Yeah, I was just going to say, one of the things that I think is a great resource is this report from IKEA. I posted a link in the chat room, and it's IKEA specific, but it sort of tells the story of how do you work with an organization like IKEA? How do you get into their supply chain? How do you think about your own growth? And I think it's a really, really good almost primer about thinking about how to work with a corporation. The other thing you talked about with Timberland, I think I see that all the time. Walmart's a great example. Walmart is the largest grocer in Latin America. And one of the challenges that they've had is getting enough high quality produce locally to meet both what their customers want, but also Walmart's commitment to lowering emissions. So they've been training farmers and making different resources available to them in understanding sort of how to work with Walmart, what kind of quality of produce they want. No obligation to sell to Walmart, but really a chance to increase their own production capabilities. You see this, Starbucks does the same thing, right? Starbucks is based on getting access to high quality coffee. And so they're also offering training to coffee producers to try to help them produce higher quality coffee. So I see a lot of that happening in the agricultural space, in the energy space, in the financial services space. I think part of I don't want to say the trick, but part of it is understanding what industry you're in and what value you can add. For example, medical is a good one to sort of dig into. Large companies are high in the medical industry, everybody's highly regulated. So for a social enterprise to be able to meet those regulatory requirements is going to be really hard and really expensive, forgetting about what your value add is, just getting to the place where you can add value. But if you think more on what are the challenges that these medical companies have, whether they're making devices or pharmaceuticals, the challenges that they have are reaching deep into the markets. So in that particular instance, the opportunity is probably going to be much more in distribution and promotion and not so much in supply chain. So I think it comes from, you as a social enterprise really understanding the industry that you're in and sort of the problem that you're able to solve that a business might be interested in. And I think this IKEA guide is just great in understanding the process and how they think and the things that you might want to do as a social enterprise.
Dave, it's I want to build on that point, and in the question here, there's also a request for, hey, do you have any successful examples of social impact organizations that initiated it? And that's kind of actually where I was going anyways. It's like a very, very well-timed question. And first, I'll tell you stories that don't work, right? And MovingWorlds gets these all the time, right? Where like one of our social enterprises will be like, hey, you did this thing with Gucci. Can you connect us to Gucci? And I'm shameless. Like, ghostwrite an email for me, and I will help I will run an introduction to anybody. Now, I can tell you with probably 80% of surety whether they will accept your introduction request or not, right? And we get this a lot. Like, hey, we have ocean plastic. Companies are starting to make things out of ocean plastic. Will you connect me to Gucci? I'll write the email. I know they're going to say no because Gucci doesn't know what the heck to do with ocean plastic, right? Let's not go sell ocean plastic to Gucci, right? Let's sell ocean plastic that we harvest out of the ocean, and let's sell that to organizations that already know how to harvest plastic, right? Let's create more local regional sales with organizations that are part of the value chain, right? So I think for social enterprises, that's one of the biggest things that we say is like, you're not ready. Don't go sell to Walmart or Gucci or Pepsi. Find the local businesses, the suppliers, the manufacturers, the distributors, the package creators. Map the value chain that you think you add value to. Ignore the biggest buyer and actually jump in and find a local supplier that you could create value for, right? And actually connect in that way. And that's where we actually see more like smaller business partnerships happening to start, right? That helps build capacity, another sale, another partner, another case study, that builds and starts to add more capacity, right? So another example, really cool coffee company in the UK, MovingWorlds did a webinar with them a few years back. They are a employment first model for addressing issues related to people experiencing homelessness, right? So they give people jobs first, and then with that jobs, then they help them find places to live and be housed, and they actually help offset some of the risk, if you will, to the housing entity by backing those individuals, right? So what they did is they started to pop up coffee shops on every corner. They said, hey, we're going to be like the Starbucks, but it's change please. We're going to have this great model. Fast forward 10 years, they make 80% of their revenue not through their coffee shops, but through bulk coffee distribution, right? Into Virgin Atlantic Airways, into what are called tier 1 suppliers like Compass Group, which then go and stock office buildings with things like coffee and snacks or others. So they actually went to those organizations and said, we've got great coffee, just as good, if not better, as the coffee than you're doing. But by the way, it's also roasted by individuals that are experiencing homelessness. Here's the great story that you can tell. So we're seeing them go and find ways in, and they're getting oftentimes denied by the big companies, but they're going to these groups that you've probably never heard of, like a Compass Group, a tier 1 supplier that does billions in revenue every year, right? But also has more local and regional offices. So I think there's examples of that. We're also seeing social enterprises plug into innovation teams, right? To go to the Gucci's of the world and say, I can't sell into core material or core supply, but can I actually partner maybe with a design group, right? Can I be a part of, can I bring our forward-thinking design innovation teams? And so even in some cases, we're seeing like Microsoft has a social enterprise initiative where they've done some work more on that kind of like innovation side of things. What I would say is the really common theme here is that you're getting a social enterprise, and I'll use the example of coffee in the value chain and say, I can make coffee more sustainable. And they look at every step of the value chain and they say, can I add value to this part of the value chain, right? Maybe, and I can do it this way. Let me go test it. Next stage of the value chain. Can I create value? Maybe, let me go test it. And in fact, there are some groups, and we cover this in our S-Grid education. One's called Thomas. I'm blanking on the 2 other names, but there are these global databases of suppliers, and there's like 500,000 businesses, right? You can actually look at, you can probably just Google like supplier repositories or supplier databases. And there's massive businesses there, huge networks of businesses. And they're increasingly actually starting to build in like ESG sorting criteria on those. So I'd say like the common theme with these examples is it's social entrepreneurs taking a very like kind of lean startup customer discovery approach, saying, let me map this value chain, find all the different types of businesses that exist along it, small, medium, and large, and then get out of the building, interview, run tests, and figure out where can they deliver value. And we're seeing some really unique partnerships form up. In some ways, not even as expected, right? Like there's one company, Kovatsev, that was like trying to sell, like they use mushrooms to grow what is essentially building materials, and they were trying to sell it, and the supplier came back and said, well, that'll never be supplied, but could we start packaging our things in your like grown mushroom things, right? So they're realizing that they can actually pivot their products a little bit to supply needs. So
Mark, I also like to use the example of Andela, which kind of figured out that there are lots of people in Africa that have tech expertise and training and are less expensive than sort of traditional employees from the West. They're now creating lots of employment, and they're filling needs for folks like Google and Apple that are looking for tech talent. So that's one of them that figured out the reverse model.
Yep, that's a great example, Dave. Anthony, I know we're up against a minute, and we're supposed to leave you a minute at the end, if I recall. So as you do that, I'll go ahead and paste a couple of the links that we were mentioning in the chat, but I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks very much, Mark. Thanks very much, David. Really great session, and I have learned a lot. So really thanks for coming and presenting here today.
Our pleasure.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Yeah, so I just have a couple of links also to put in the chat. So if everyone could take a look at that, we'd love for you to fill in our feedback survey about Catalyzing Change Week. And also, if you're not a member yet, please do come and join our community. So thanks to everyone for being here. Thanks to Mark and David. I'll hand back to you to close. But yeah.
Well, perfect. Thanks, Anthony. We appreciate the opportunity. David, super fun chatting with you about this. Again, really appreciate you all jumping in, asking some good questions. On that last slide, we did have our contact info and details. So if you want to follow up on any of this, go ahead. Otherwise, we also shared the link to the slides, the link to the report, which also has our info. And so if you ever want to get in touch and nerd out on this, let us know. Cool. Thanks everybody for being here. Dave, thanks so much.
Sticking around and some good questions. And thanks, Mark and Anthony.
Thanks to you both, and thanks to everyone who attended.
Cool. Thanks,
Take care.
Bye.